In the southern part of an African country bordered by the Gulf of Guinea, where the calm yet mysterious Ovia River flows peacefully through the Eldo-speaking land, lies the village of Unuame. The river had long been a silent witness to the unyielding traditions and unspoken tensions between Unuame and the neighbouring village, Esosa. The dense vegetation that lined the riverbanks gave the landscape an almost mystical air, with the sound of birds and insects filling the air. The Ovia River, while a source of life, also stood as a symbolic divide between the two communities. It was said that in the time before time, Unuame and Esosa had been one people, but an ancient feud, shrouded in the fog of forgotten grievances, had driven a wedge between the two communities. No one remembered exactly what caused the rift, but the hostility was passed down through generations, becoming a way of life. As far back as anyone could recall, it had been strictly forbidden for anyone from Unuame to court, let alone marry someone from Esosa. The penalty for breaking this unspoken rule was severe: banishment. The law was clear and it was absolute. In the quiet corners of Unuame, tales were still told of those who had dared to cross the boundary of this ancient rivalry. A young man, not unlike Esosa, had once fallen in love with a woman from Esosa. Their love was pure, but when it was discovered, their fate was swift and brutal. Banished from their homes, they were never heard from again. Their story had become a cautionary tale, a reminder to the people of Unuame and Esosa that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. Esosa, a young man in his early 20s, had grown up with this understanding ingrained in him. Tall, with a wiry frame and the sharp features of his forebears, Esosa had always been one to respect tradition, even when it chafed against his own sense of individualism. He loved his village and its people, but there was a part of him that longed for more. A life beyond the Ovia River, where the boundaries of old feuds did not define one's future. He had dreams, ambitions, but those ambitions seemed always to be tempered by the weight of his ancestry. In Esosa, Chioma lived with a similar burden. The daughter of a respected Esosa family, she was known for her beauty and her sharp wit. Her striking dark eyes and smooth skin often drew attention, but she carried the weight of expectations that came with being from such a well-regarded family. Chioma, too, was aware of the long-standing feud between Esosa and Unuame. Like Esosa, she had heard the stories from her elders, and like him, she was torn between the deep-rooted traditions of her village and her own quiet yearning for a different life, one that was not defined by the enmity of the past. Fate, it seemed, had a way of working in mysterious ways. It was a hot afternoon when Esosa first saw her. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over the community of Ema, a village far from both Unuame and Esosa. The government had organized a one-week skill acquisition and human development program for youths from several surrounding communities. For many, it was an opportunity to learn trades and develop skills, but for Esosa, it was a rare chance to escape the constraints of his village life, if only for a short while. Chioma, too, had been selected to represent Esosa at the event. She hadn't wanted to go initially, but her parents had insisted. They believed it was a good opportunity for her to network and possibly gain useful skills. Begrudgingly, she had agreed, packing her things and making the long journey to Ema. The event coordinators, perhaps unaware or uncaring of the deep-rooted tensions between Unuame and Esosa, had made a crucial error. Esosa and Chioma, both strangers to each other, were assigned to share the same apartment for the week-long event. When Elfosa arrived and saw Elkiomado standing by the door, her eyes scanning the list with a frown on her face, his stomach lurched. He immediately recognized the symbols of her village from the bracelet on her wrist. Esosa, he muttered under his breath, trying to suppress his immediate discomfort. Elkiomado turned, locking eyes with him, and something in the air shifted. For a moment, neither spoke. They both knew what this meant. Unuame and Esosa, the rivalry, the feud. It was a taboo for them to even stand this close, much less share an apartment. Elkiomado's expression hardened. "There's been a mistake," she said quickly, brushing past Elfosa and walking towards one of the coordinators. She returned a few minutes later, frustration evident on her face. "There are no other rooms," she said flatly. "They told me we'll have to manage." Elfosa's mind raced. A part of him wanted to protest, but another part, a more rebellious part, told him that it didn't matter. They were far from their villages, far from the watchful eyes of their people. No one here knew about the feud, the traditions that held them captive back home. Here, in this faraway community, they were just two individuals, strangers really, forced into an awkward situation. "Well," Elfosa finally said, breaking the silence, "we can make this work, I suppose. We'll keep to our rooms. No need to make it more complicated than it has to be." Elkiomado nodded, though there was a hint of defiance in her eyes. "Agreed. We'll stay out of each other's way." But even as they turned away from each other, each retreating into their own room, a strange tension lingered in the air between them, one that neither could fully explain, yet both felt deeply. The week progressed slowly, each day filled with lectures, practical sessions, and various activities meant to enrich the participants. Elfosa and Elkiomado kept their distance from each other, just as they had agreed. During the day, they attended different sessions, mingled with other youths, and stayed as far apart as possible. But once the day's activities were done, they found themselves back in the small apartment, sharing a silence that grew more unbearable with each passing evening. At first, they barely spoke, exchanging only the most basic of courtesies. "Good night, good morning, is the bathroom free?" It was almost as if they were trying to erase each other's presence from their surroundings, pretending that the other wasn't there. But the tension was impossible to ignore. One evening, after an exhausting day, Elfosa sat at the small wooden table in the living area, attempting to read a book. The hum of the ceiling fan above him was the only sound in the room, but it did little to soothe the growing restlessness he felt. His eyes kept darting toward Elkiomado's door, and he found himself wondering what she was doing. Was she feeling the same unease? Just as the thought crossed his mind, Elkiomado emerged from her room. She was dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair loosely tied back. She paused when she saw Elfosa sitting there, their eyes locking for a brief moment before she quickly looked away. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Elfosa shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, though his heart had begun to beat faster. "It's a free table." She sat down, pulling out a notebook and some papers, clearly preparing to work. The silence stretched between them, but there was something different about it this time. It was as though the quietness was no longer enough to keep them apart. Both could feel it, the magnetic pull that was growing stronger with each passing day. After a while, Elkiomado sighed and pushed her papers aside. "You know, it's strange," she said, her voice breaking the stillness. "We've been avoiding each other, yet it feels like, I don't know, like it's not helping." Elfosa looked up from his book, surprised by her candidness. "You feel it too." Elkiomado nodded. Yes, I thought staying out of each other's way would make things easier, but... She trailed off, biting her lip as she chose her next words carefully. It's almost like trying to avoid the elephant in the room. The elephant being the fact that we're from villages that hate each other, Esosa said dryly, his lips curling into a half-smile. Elkiomado smiled back, but it was a sad, resigned smile. Yeah, something like that. For the first time since they had met, they shared a laugh. It was brief and awkward, but it broke through the barrier that had been holding them apart. The tension that had hung in the air was slowly dissolving into something else, something neither of them could deny. Esosa leaned back in his chair, looking at Elkiomado more openly now. It's ridiculous, you know, that our entire lives are dictated by something that happened so long ago, something we don't even know the full story about. I've thought the same thing, Elkiomado replied, leaning forward. It's like we're living someone else's feud, and we don't even know why. But no one dares question it because that's how it's always been. They fell into an easy conversation after that, talking about their villages, their families, and the strange unspoken rules that govern their lives. Esosa found that Elkiomado was easy to talk to, smart, thoughtful, and most surprisingly funny. He had always imagined people from Esosa to be cold and aloof. But Elkiomado was anything but. She had a warmth about her that drew him in, despite the barriers they had both been trying to maintain. As the night wore on, their conversation deepened. They spoke about their dreams, their frustrations, and their desires for a future that wasn't bound by the expectations of their villages. I've always wanted to leave Unuame, Esosa admitted at one point. Travel, see the world, live somewhere where people don't care about old rivalries. I feel the same way, Elkiomado said softly. I've always dreamed of moving to the city, building a life on my own terms. But it's so hard to break free, isn't it? My family, they expect so much from me. And if I defy them, they'll banish you, Esosa finished for her, nodding. Same here. I've seen it happen. You don't follow the rules, and you're out. They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was a shared understanding. A moment of quiet reflection on the lives they had been born into and the impossible choices they faced. It was late when they finally decided to call it a night. As Elkiomado stood to leave, her fingers brushed lightly against Esosa's arm, and for a split second the world seemed to stop. He looked up at her, his breath catching in his throat. She hesitated, her hand lingering on his skin longer than it should have. Neither of them moved. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something dangerous and forbidden. They both knew the consequences of giving in to it, but the pull was too strong to ignore. Elkiomado withdrew her hand, her cheeks flushed. "Good night, Esosa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good night, Elkiomado," he replied, his voice husky with unspoken emotions. As she disappeared into her room, Esosa sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door. He could feel the weight of what had just passed between them, and for the first time, he realized just how impossible it would be to resist. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Esosa and Elkiomado continued their conversations, growing closer with each passing night. They would talk for hours, sharing stories, laughing, and slowly, inevitably falling into something neither of them could control. But the more they talked, the more they tried to fight the growing attraction between them. They told themselves that they were just friends, that nothing more could come of this. But the tension between them was undeniable, and every moment they spent together only heightened it. One evening, after another long day of activities, Efosa returned to the apartment to find Elkiomado sitting on the couch, her face a mix of frustration and sadness. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I can't do this anymore, Efosa. I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you." Efosa's heart raced. He had been waiting for this moment, yet now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to say. "Elkiomado, I feel it too," he admitted, his voice low. "But we can't. You know we can't." "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "But what are we supposed to do? I can't stop thinking about you, and every time I try to fight it, it just gets worse." Efosa reached out, gently taking her hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through both of them. They sat there for a moment holding hands, their hearts pounding in unison. And then, without thinking, Efosa leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it was enough to shatter the walls they had built around themselves. They pulled back, breathless, staring at each other in shock and wonder. "Elkiomado," Efosa began, but she silenced him with another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent. In that moment they both knew there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, and now they had to face the consequences, together. The night after their first kiss, the air in their shared apartment seemed to buzz with an electric tension that neither Efosa nor Elkiomado could ignore. Their connection had crossed an invisible line, and they both knew there was no going back to the simple, polite interactions of their first few days together. What had started as a quiet rebellion against the enmity between their villages had grown into something much larger, something far more dangerous, a forbidden love that neither of them could control, nor did they want to. For the next few days they moved cautiously around each other, unsure of how to navigate this new reality. They still attended the training sessions, mingled with others, and pretended nothing had changed when in public. But the moment they were alone, the atmosphere would shift. Every glance, every touch, even the simplest exchange of words seemed to carry an unspoken promise of something more. It wasn't long before the attraction between them became undeniable. Late one evening, after another day of keeping up appearances, Efosa returned to the apartment to find Elkiomado standing on the small balcony outside their shared living room. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her, illuminating her features and making her look almost ethereal. For a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, simply watching her, his heart pounding as he realized how deeply he had fallen for her. Elkiomado must have sensed his presence because she turned to face him, her dark eyes locking with his. The look they shared was one of complete understanding, of mutual surrender. Without a word, Efosa stepped outside, joining her on the balcony, the cool night breeze washing over them. They stood side by side, neither saying a word, but the tension between them was palpable. Finally, Elkiomado broke the silence. "Efosa, what are we doing?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I can't stop thinking about you. I tried to fight it, but I can't." Elkiomado looked down, her hands gripping the railing. "We're going to get in so much trouble," she whispered. "If anyone finds out—" "No one has to find out," Efosa interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "We can keep this between us. Just for now. Just until we figure things out." Elkiomado hesitated, her heart torn between the weight of her fears and the undeniable pull of her feelings. But what if we can't figure it out? What if we have to go back to our villages and pretend this never happened? Efosa's grip on her hand tightened slightly. We'll deal with that when the time comes. But for now, I don't want to pretend. The vulnerability in his voice broke through her resolve, and before she could stop herself, she turned toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. Neither do I, she whispered, stepping closer. In an instant they were in each other's arms, their lips crashing together in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. This time there was no hesitation, no fear holding them back. Their kiss deepened, fueled by the pent-up emotions they had both been struggling to suppress. The forbidden nature of their love only seemed to heighten the intensity of the moment, making it impossible for either of them to stop. They stumbled back into the apartment, still wrapped in each other's embrace. The heat between them was undeniable now, a force neither of them could resist. They made their way to the couch, where they collapsed together, their bodies entwined as they explored the passion that had been building between them for days. Each kiss, each touch, was a release of all the tension and longing they had been bottling up since the moment they met. As they lay together, their breathing heavy and their hearts racing, a sense of both euphoria and dread began to settle over them. The room was silent, except for the sound of their shallow breaths, and in that quiet moment reality began to creep back in. Efosa pulled back slightly, his hand brushing a strand of hair away from Elkiomado's face. "What happens now?" he asked softly, his voice laced with both awe and uncertainty. Elkiomado looked up at him, her eyes filled with the same mix of emotions. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't regret this, not even for a second." A soft smile tugged at Efosa's lips as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Neither do I." They remained there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the weight of their situation began to settle in. Despite the passion and excitement of their forbidden romance, they both knew the risks they were taking. The consequences of their love would be devastating if their families or villages found out. But in that moment, with the warmth of each other's bodies still lingering, those consequences seemed far away. Unreal, even. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret glances. Efosa and Elkiomado were careful not to let anyone at the event suspect what was happening between them, but the passion they shared behind closed doors only grew stronger. They found solace in each other's company, escaping the burdens of their village expectations, even if only for a short time. But the weight of their love was always there, looming over them like a dark cloud. They spoke in whispers late into the night, discussing what would happen when the event ended and they returned to their villages. "We can't keep this a secret forever," Elkiomado said one night, her voice quiet but filled with concern. "Eventually someone will find out. And then what?" Efosa was silent for a moment, staring up at the ceiling. He had been thinking the same thing for days, but he didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he finally said. "I wish I could tell you that we'll figure it out, that we'll find a way to be together without losing everything. But I can't promise that." Elkiomado sighed, rolling onto her side to face him. "It's not fair. Why should we be punished for something that happened so long ago? Why should we be the ones to suffer for a feud we had no part in?" Efosa turned to her, his eyes filled with the same frustration. "I don't know. But what I do know is that I love you, Elkiomado, and I'm not going to let this feud dictate how we live our lives." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion. Elkiomado felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not because she was sad, but because she was overwhelmed by the depth of her feelings for him. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They kissed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't fueled by passion or desire, but by something deeper, a shared understanding that no matter what happened, they were in this together. Their love was forbidden, yes, but it was also undeniable. And now, they would have to face the consequences. As the final day of the event approached, the reality of their situation began to weigh more heavily on both of them. Soon, they would return to their respective villages, to the lives that had been carefully laid out for them by tradition and family expectations. But now, everything had changed. On the last night of the event, they lay in each other's arms, savoring the last few hours they had together before they would be forced to part ways. There was a sadness in the air, but also a sense of determination. "We can't go back to pretending this never happened," Esosa said softly, his voice firm. "We have to find a way." Ekene nodded, her heart heavy. "But what if there's no way? What if we're forced to choose between our families and each other?" Esosa was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Then we'll have to choose." The final day of the event arrived, and the atmosphere between Esosa and Ekene was heavy with the inevitable. After a week of secrecy, stolen kisses and deep conversations, the time had come for them to return to their villages. The bus that would take them back to their separate worlds was already waiting, its engine idling outside. The thought of leaving each other was almost unbearable, but there was nothing they could do. They had agreed to stay quiet about their romance once they got back home, but both knew that keeping such a secret forever was impossible. As they stood in the small apartment, packing their belongings in silence, the weight of their unspoken fears pressed down on them. Ekene was the first to speak. "What if someone finds out? We've been so careful, but the moment we step back into our villages, everything will change. I'm scared, Esosa." Esosa turned to her, his expression serious but filled with resolve. "I'm scared too, but I also know that I don't want to lose you, not after everything we've shared." Ekene's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "But what are we supposed to do? We can't just run away. Our families, our villages, they'll come after us. They'll never let us be together." Esosa stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I don't know what the answer is, Ekene, but I know that I can't go back to my life and pretend none of this happened. I can't forget you. I won't." Ekene swallowed hard, feeling the same emotions swirling in her chest. The thought of returning to Esosa, of facing her family and pretending she didn't love Esosa was impossible. But the consequences of their love were equally terrifying. Banishment, exile. These were not just idle threats. They were very real, and they both knew it. Their final moments together were spent in quiet reflection, neither wanting to say goodbye, but knowing they had no choice. The bus horn blared outside, signaling it was time to leave. Esosa pulled Ekene into one last embrace, his hands trembling slightly as he held her close. "We'll find a way," he whispered into her hair, though the uncertainty in his voice was unmistakable. Ekene clung to him, her tears finally spilling over. "Promise me you won't forget me," she whispered. "Never," Esosa replied, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll find you. No matter what happens, I'll find you." With one final kiss they parted, each walking toward their respective buses, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the world they were returning to might never accept their love. Back in Unuame, Esosa felt the weight of his village's expectations settling over him like a shroud. His family was thrilled to have him back, asking about the training and the people he had met. but all Esosa could think about was Chioma. The thought of her back in Esosa, just a few miles away but separated by centuries of hatred, gnawed at him. He knew they couldn't stay apart for long. Chioma's return to Esosa was no less difficult. Her family was overjoyed to see her, especially her father, who had high hopes that she would soon marry someone from their village, securing a strong alliance with a prominent family. But Chioma's heart wasn't in any of it. All she could think about was Esosa, and the thought of living without him made her feel as though she was suffocating. For the first few days they managed to keep their distance, sending only a few secret letters through trusted friends in a neighbouring village. The letters were short, but filled with longing, each one reaffirming their commitment to find a way to be together. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that their situation was far more precarious than they had imagined. One evening, as Esosa was sitting with his family in their compound, a group of elders from the village council arrived unexpectedly. The atmosphere grew tense as they were escorted to the center of the compound, their faces somber and filled with purpose. Esosa's father greeted them, his voice laced with apprehension. "We have heard troubling rumors," began Elder Oronse, the oldest among them. "You've dishonored our village by consorting with a woman from Esosa, breaking our sacred law. You know the consequences." Esosa's heart raced, but before he could respond, another elder, Oputa, a man of great wisdom and influence, raised his hand. "Oronsaye, I believe it's time we re-examine this law. For generations, we have upheld it without truly understanding why. Does anyone here even remember how this feud started?" The other elders murmured, caught off guard by Oputa's boldness. For as long as anyone could remember, the banishment law had been sacred, yet no one seemed to know its origins. "Are we to continue punishing our children for a feud whose roots we have forgotten?" Oputa continued. "Esosa's love for Chioma does not dishonor us. It gives us a chance to heal old wounds." Oronsa's eyes narrowed. "You wish to dismantle our tradition? Without tradition, we are nothing." Oputa met his gaze steadily. "Without love, we are nothing. We cannot remain bound by hatred that no longer serves us." After a heated debate, the elders agreed to an unprecedented step. They would call for a council between Unuame and Esosa to vote on the fate of the banishment law itself. A week later, the two councils gathered by the Ovia River, the natural boundary between their villages. The air was thick with tension, the villagers on both sides watching from a distance. Elder Oputa spoke first, addressing both councils. "We have lived with this law for too long, divided by something none of us truly understands. Today we have the chance to change that. Let us vote. Should we keep this law or abolish it?" Oronsaye, unwilling to concede, countered with a stern warning. "If we abolish it, we risk chaos. Traditions hold our villages together." The elders approached the ceremonial bowl at the river's edge, where they would cast their votes. A white stone for abolishing the law, a black stone for keeping it. The tension was palpable as each elder made their choice, the crowd watching in silence. When the last stone was cast, the count was taken. The result was clear. More elders had voted for the abolition of the banishment law. A collective gasp rose from the villagers, followed by cheers from the younger ones. Esosa and Chioma's love had sparked change. The centuries-old divide was finally broken, and the villages of Unuame and Esosa began the slow but hopeful path toward unity. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or any questions, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay awesome.